It has officially been a month since Xenoblade X's return, and in case you missed it, I've already posted a comprehensive review. That was primarily spoiler-free though, so I've been itching to expand my thoughts on the new story contents as well as the divisive state of the community. It seems like this game just can't help it, and quite frankly, it shouldn't be a surprise. I predicted this entire discourse all the way back in December. There's opinions all over the place, and I don't just mean Chapter 13, I mean all over the place. Now we have some people saying that the base story is actually pretty good, and the community is only harsh because they compare it to the trilogy, and that's where the issues begin. There seems to be some misunderstandings about the perception of the story, and this needs to be straightened out before we even get to the new chapter. It's not just Xenoblade fans. The main campaign has always been widely considered lackluster. You can even find this by just looking at the reviews of Definitive Edition. The problem here is the way we talk about it as a community. If you're a newcomer to Xenoblade X, there's a good chance you've seen countless individuals wave off the story as bad or mid. Mid is supposed to mean average, but it's basically used the same way as bad. This is just typical online behavior, but what nobody seems to understand is that when you are repeatedly dismissive without any sort of context, it does not have the effect you think it has. If anything, it makes new players enjoy it more, because you've set the bar so irrationally low that any redeeming quality is going to be all the more impactful. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the narrative of Xenoblade X. It has plenty of unique plot elements and twists to get invested in, particularly with the side quests. But the main campaign is blatantly flawed, to the point that its damage is still felt today. So that is why, instead of using the word bad to describe the original story, I prefer using terms such as boring and trivial, because those are the two main qualities that the new story content had to alleviate. The first few chapters are the definition of boring and trivial. They somehow take hours to explain concepts that could easily be portrayed in minutes. The most notorious example, of course, being the 10-minute cutscene that is quickly summarized with a basic menu, about a mechanic, by the way, that was practically removed. The beginning of Xenoblade X is the antithesis of show, don't tell. It does not respect your time or intelligence. And for those who insist I'm over-exaggerating, let me ask you a simple question. If you were to skip all of the cutscenes explaining New LA, do you sincerely believe you would understand the game less? The answer should be no, but the fact you even hesitated is the issue. And that is sadly the tip of the iceberg when it comes to being boring and trivial. Take the characters for instance. Tatsu is a mere scapegoat. The cast is generally shallow despite the affinity quest you are forced to play through. I mean, look at the default ensemble of protagonists. Besides Elma and Lyn, who do you see yourself thinking about in a week, let alone a day? It doesn't help that most of the chapters are rather uneventful. Seriously, if you just beat the game, I dare you to try to remember even half of them. It's certainly more difficult than it should be, as there isn't much conflict or tension to hold on to, and the handful of exceptions tend to lack any substance. Remember the tainted monsters and the Telethia that were both presented as these gargantuan threats, only to never appear in the story ever again? Remember when New LA was attacked and set on fire, yet conveniently wasn't damaged enough to have any real consequence? Remember when Gosha flashed her ass, proceeded to have no depth whatsoever, and then abruptly died off screen? And if I'm mispronouncing her name, by the way, that is exactly my point here. Remember when Riz and Dagon seemed like they were going to have depth, until psych, just kidding. Remember when the main antagonist, Luxar, had any screen time? Because I sure don't. Remember when the main protagonist had no direct influence on finding the Lifehold Core, despite how urgent of a goal it is throughout the whole story? Really, the only tangible conflict is Lao's betrayal. And look, I understand that Chapter 11 is kind of beloved, especially by the new player base. While I personally did not care for it, I'm glad you had something. But regardless of this chapter in particular, the build-up was terrible. Before Chapter 9, the writers made it so obvious that Lao was suspicious. It was as if they went out of their way to avoid subtlety. And so, in Chapter 9, they said, fuck it. Elma basically tells you straight to your face that Lao is going to betray you. But the worst part is Chapter 10. Van Damme mentions there is a traitor among their ranks, and there is zero mention of Lao? Like I'm just supposed to forget the last conversation we had? Whatever happened to quote-unquote giving him a chance to explain himself? He doesn't appear at all in Chapter 10, presumably to make his subsequent betrayal at least a little bit surprising. The thing is though, I am not asking for a shocking plot twist. I am asking not to be shocked by how poorly it was written. When a betrayal is choreographed to this extent, it is deprived of all tension and just makes the characters look dumb. I know Elma and Doug wanted to believe in Lao, but that's a stupid excuse when, you know, the fate of humanity is on their shoulders. There's a big difference between giving someone the benefit of the doubt and doing absolutely nothing. But I'll give Chapter 11 some credit. It was the one time in the main campaign where there was a remotely engaging conflict with a remotely developed character with a remotely satisfying payoff. While it is far from ideal, this is what storytelling is supposed to look like. There should have been more of this in the campaign. It being open world is not an excuse with how long and abundant the cutscenes are. And that brings me to the original ending, the cliffhanger that is the root of the controversy, the inarguably worst plot development Monolith Soft has ever written. Let's boil it down to 3 revelations. 1, the Lifehold Core is destroyed, and yet the Mimiosomes are still functioning. 2, Lao was supposed to have died, and yet he is inexplicably alive. And 3, it's something about this planet. For all the newcomers out there, it is imperative to understand that for 10 years, this was generally considered a disappointing, nonsensical cliffhanger. Do not be fooled by revisionist history. No matter what your opinions are on Chapter 13, Monolith Soft had plenty of reason to course correct. We've already demonstrated the lack of consequences in the main story, but this cliffhanger takes it to another level. If the Lifehold Core was never necessary to begin with, then that means there was never any goal, and thus there was never any story. This was just 12 chapters of filler, especially if Lao is still alive. As I said before, his betrayal was the only substantial conflict. If he survived after all of that, then truly, there were never any consequences. And then there's the single piece of dialogue that burdened Monolith Soft for 10 years. It's something about this planet. This was the tiniest crumb that the Xenoblade X community desperately held onto for an entire decade. They put it on a pedestal. They convinced themselves that it was something worth being optimistic about. And to be fair, it wasn't completely unfounded. The bizarre workings of Mira had already been alluded to by many compelling side quests as well as the mere ability to seamlessly communicate with aliens. So the prospect of that being expanded upon did indeed earn that intrigue. But here is the question that those fans do not want to hear. It's a question that they'll be upset at me for even asking. If Mira really is a mysterious planet that has allowed them to survive as long as they have, so what? Isn't that a good thing? There's nothing about this cliffhanger that antagonizes Mira. In fact, there's nothing about it that introduces any sort of conflict. The best we have is some unknown person in a black hoodie who doesn't really do anything. There's also a chilling sentence, "This story never truly ends," but that would imply a story ever began. They could have said they lived happily ever after, and that would have honestly made more sense. Do you see my point here? Not only did the game just undermine its main campaign, but it had the gall to be anticlimactic as if it wasn't already way too anticlimactic. So much of the ongoing backlash stems from the idea that there was this master plan that was suddenly abandoned, when in reality, there is nothing promising about this cliffhanger. It did not give us anything tangible. It's just something that people fantasized about for 10 years because, well, that's how it ended. They believed in this cliffhanger simply because they wanted to. But just like how we wanted to believe in Lao, it was naive at best and oblivious at worst. I cannot understate that everything I just said has been echoed for a decade. This is not me re-examining the game. This was a general consensus that is still relevant today. I need to reiterate that as much as I can because it should open your eyes as to why Chapter 13 is the way it is. When you have an overly ambiguous cliffhanger that provides no real conflict aside from its poor reception, then you're gonna have to take some drastic measures to salvage it. Now, I've already spoken quite a bit about the new chapter in my full review, so I'd rather not sound like too much of a broken record. Please go back to that video if you want to hear more. Right now, I want to focus on Chapter 13 within the context of fixing the story. As this is the argument I'm sure you're dying to yell about. How can it fix the story when it isn't even telling the same story? That's the main criticism I've seen, the accusation that Chapter 13 is not faithful to the original narrative, with Mira's apparent destruction being most symbolic. First of all, it is a testament to how well Mira is designed when you have this many people genuinely feeling hurt. I've even seen a few claiming that they don't even want to play the game anymore because what's the point? This is not the first time Xenoblade has had a doomed world. Torna in Xenoblade 3 ends similarly, but that doesn't put a damper on getting to know their worlds. If anything, the tragedy makes me appreciate it more. I cannot relate to this notion that the story was about the planet specifically, and so the planet specifically needed to survive. Yes, it was the setting. It's not like they weren't going to try to make a living here. But if that's the only theme you came away with, especially from the campaign, then that's just another instance of how flawed its writing was and what needed to be fixed. I will give you this. I do think it should have been emphasized that Mira was supernatural, just not as much as we thought. In terms of humanity's consciousness, I much prefer the explanation of a universal mechanism. It may seem abrupt, but it actually fits in with the plot elements of the Xenoblade trilogy and even Xenosaga. While I personally can't speak for the latter, there is no way that Xenoblade 3 was written without X in mind. The parallels are as clear as day. By introducing the rift between worlds, X cements itself as a bona fide Xeno game and lives up to the Japanese title of Xenoblade Cross. In Monolith Soft's own words, it represents a place that can serve as a crossroad where people can come across one another unexpectedly. So it is more than reasonable for Mira to be the force that drew them together and gave them the ability to communicate. That is never explicitly confirmed, which I do find weird because it's not like it would have interfered with the story. But this is where Chapter 13 is more faithful to Xenoblade Cross than the main campaign ever was. The rift is as close as you can get to a literal interpretation, but figuratively speaking, a crossroads is a famous metaphor that Xenoblade 3 fans should be quite familiar with. It conveys a pressing, climatic decision before one can move on with their lives, a predicament that wasn't really in the main campaign, but it is very much so in Chapter 13. The leaders of New LA have to decide whether to repeat the casualties of Project Exodus or to risk everything by trying to save everyone. The citizens have to decide whether to die with the planet they've grown to love or to be on the run yet again. Because Mira itself is the crossroads, and a crossroads is not a permanent home. It may have brought them together, but it was always intended to prepare them for their next destination. The aliens in particular reiterate several times that what they're going through on Mira is just a tiny sliver of an intergalactic plight. Heck, the last thing you hear before the credits roll is Lynn, the narrator and arguably the central protagonist, expressing humanity's desire to leave Mira in search of planet Earth. And if you want to get really sappy about it, she may have been spoiling the new ending all along. Furthermore, what makes a crossroads so pivotal is the consequences, the very thing that was lacking in the main campaign. And this chapter rectifies that by not only seemingly destroying Mira, but having the ghosts be responsible. Yeah, remember how these major antagonists were introduced in the opening cutscene and then never appeared again? The ghosts imbue an actual meaning to this story never truly ends, because they continue to haunt humanity. Their time on Mira came to a close the same way it began. That's right, for once, we get to have an effective antagonist. The next time we see the ghosts, and I assure you we will, you are going to take them seriously and will want to learn more about them. That is how you provide a substantial external conflict, not to mention all of the internal conflicts that come along with Al's return and Mira's destruction. The drama is unanimously more tangible. Even the multiverse has a payoff with a clear ambition for the future. And ultimately, that is how Chapter 13 fixes the story, or at least as much as it could. It fixes the story by turning it into an actual story, instead of a mishmash of abstract concepts with a few bad guys along the way. It may not be what you expected, but if you directly compare it to every other chapter combined, you should be able to notice a huge step up in quality. I am not saying it is perfect by any means. There is a lot of exposition to make up for lost time, and the perceived change in direction does feel jarring at first. But given the extremely dubious state of the original narrative, it was impossible to make everybody happy. Even if they did make this a full-on sequel, it would just end up being a longer reality check. Monolith Soft had long since backed themselves into a corner, so the best thing they could do was go out swinging. They gave Elma and Lyn a ton more depth by proving they had much more to life than their role in Project Exodus. They made the Ghosts and Samarians the intergalactic authority they were supposed to be from the get-go. They gave Al and the Ares the spotlight they deserved after all of the teasing from the base game and the popular fan speculation over their return. They made the story consequential because the player avatar gets to grow as a hero instead of having no agency for the sake of various twists. Elma being an alien now matters instead of just being a neat twist. Lao gets to have an emotional conclusion instead of reviving in an unnecessary twist. The Great One the antagonist worshipped is now finally given a purpose instead of playing second fiddle to a predictable twist. And the Lifehold Core plays a crucial role in their escape instead of being undermined by a self-sabotaging twist. They heightened the stakes with this batshit crazy lore that remains faithful to the original theme of a crossroads. And most of all, far and away above everything else, they scrapped the Tatsu jokes. Simply put, the narrative has become much more meaningful than it ever was before. It turned a cliffhanger that was only hypothetically interesting into a coherent ending that is fun yet full of grief. Emotions that you strongly feel instead of just imagining. Because even if you don't agree with certain decisions or the overall direction, I bet you're quite vocal about it. You're probably going into detail, type in paragraphs, rather than just calling it bad. After all, the one thing that you and I can no longer say is that Xenoblade X's story is boring and trivial.